challenges of the day, behoves Africa to behave as a continent and not a continent in fragments. So thank you very much for braving, absenting yourself from the Soccer World Cup. I am told that if you compete with soccer, chances are you lose. So it looks like we have won, and thanks to you. We are going to have a conversation on the subject matter South Africa in Africa, the importance or imperative of adopting or re-adopting, because we appear to have lost sight of that, a Pan-African mindset in business and politics, or just as Africans, as it were. My name is Ruel Koza. On behalf of Vets Business School, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I am a visiting professor here. They call me visiting adjunct professor. I love the visiting. I'm not too sure of the adjunct because I don't know what it means. But it just doesn't sound very friendly. Adjunct. Visiting is good. Pan-Africanism, I want to submit, is an old age concept that has seen generations of African leaders determined to forge solidarity among African states. In other words, to render Africa a continent that is coherent and integrated. The African Union's Agenda 2063, titled "The Africa We Want," in other words, a desirable Africa, is recommitted to a prosperous and politically united continent based on sustainable development and inclusive growth. From the groundbreaking ideals of Ghanaian revolutionary Kwame Nkrumah, who actually opined that until and unless the last square inch of Africa is liberated, Africa is not liberated. From about his time to the African Renaissance, institutionalized and immortalized by former President Thabo Mbeki, to the ideals of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, what has happened to Pan-Africanism in 2018? We'll be discussing issues germane to that. Is it still relevant? Is Pan-Africanism relevant? Is it still an ideal that people want to strive for? Where are we with the African Renaissance? During Mbeki's presidency, the African Renaissance was like a halo over our heads. What has happened to that? Has it been taken further or wiped out virtually by his successor? Are we open for business in a way that ensures holistic growth across the country and continent? Is Africa likely to succeed, to survive rather, the 21st century scramble for Africa? In particular, in the light of the dragon that is actually spreading its tentacle. We know a great deal about that, but are we doing anything to make sure that in the wake of the havoc it's likely to wreak, we shall still be the Africa that we desire to be? Are we going to survive globalization? Are we going to optimize what it is we eke out of the wave of globalization that continues sweeping? It's been sweeping for some time, but it's sweeping over all continents, over all countries, and we are no exception. Are we going to survive its ravages? Are we going to benefit from that which it is positioned to dish out? I leave these questions with you as I introduce our panelists this evening, who will be grappling with this topic. South Africa in Africa, the importance or imperative of readopting a Pan-African mindset in business and politics. First up is Lynette Chan, who has been a colleague of mine for some 8 to 10 years at the NEPA Business Foundation. Lynette is an African development expert, having actively contributed to initiatives such as the BE Charter and the Presidential International Advisory Council, or the ICT, in South Africa. She was formerly a senior government and public affairs manager, senior executive at Hewlett Packard, South Africa. She serves on various boards, including FunPen, which has to do with agriculture and food security. And she was the vice chair of Enablis. She might refer to that perhaps during her talk, and is a fellow of the Aspen Institute's African Leadership Initiative. She will be the first one to address us. Second is Professor William Gumede, who is an associate professor at the Wits Business School of Governance, just next door. They are our neighbors. He is executive chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation and former deputy editor and managing editor of the Sowetan. During the anti-apartheid struggle, Gumede held several leadership positions in South African student, civic, and trade union movements. He was a political violence mediator and area coordinator for the National Peace Committee during the multi-party negotiations for a democratic South Africa, and was seconded to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He is the best-selling author of several books, including Thabo Mbeki and The Battle for the Soul of the ANC, and the Poverty of Ideas, South African Democracy and Retreat of the Intellectuals. In fact, I think this is very, very important because our intellectuals are somewhat coy, among several other books that he has written. And lastly, we'll have Professor Somadoda Fikeni. You otherwise know him as just Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, who is an acknowledged expert and specialist in the areas of political science, public policy development and analysis, history, political economy, and heritage. So just about everything that is applied social science, he grapples with as it affects humanity. He is recognized as a leading public commentator on politics, policy, economic, social, and heritage issues in major South African and international media and forums. He is an honorary professor at UNISA and has been voted as the #1 political analyst in South Africa on a popular national radio station. He is chairperson of the IDT board, chairperson of Eminent Persons Group, and has just been appointed as one of the members of BRICS Think Tank Forum. So we have very, very eminent, well-qualified people to address the subject matter. I'll probably add 1 or 2 things at the tail end, but in essence, that was my job. And I need to also, perhaps ab initio, thank Sassel, who provided snacks. So you don't have to rush home to eat your usual food. There'll be a fair amount of food for us to nibble at and continue with informal and non-formal conversations. May I, at this stage, hand over to Lynette Chan.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. And also, I'm very honored to be sitting on this esteemed panel. I'm probably the only one that does not have a doctor or professor prefix. But I will provide as much knowledge as I've experienced over the last 11 to 12 years working at the NEPAD Business Foundation as the CEO. And I'd also like to acknowledge at this moment that Dr. Ruel Khoza was our founding chairman, so it was due to his vision and foresight around an integrated and prosperous Africa under NEPAD that business came together at the request of former President Thabo Mbeki to urge business to support the implementation of NEPAD. And so it's a great honor to be with you today, Dr. Khoza.
Thank you.
Under NEPAD as a new partnership for Africa's development, I think the genesis in 2001 was when 5 African leaders, presidents came together from Algeria, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa and Egypt, who each had their own version of what a prosperous and integrated Africa should look like. And so there were many Pan-African guidelines or frameworks that were put forth, and they decided to combine that together into what is now known as the New Partnership for Africa's Development. And those were esteemed, great African leaders who unfortunately have stepped down from office. And thus the questions that Dr. Khoza asked about what has happened to this Pan-African vision since, and have the leaders since then stepped up to the plate or not. And so what I'm going to try and attempt to answer today is that whilst there's not been much visibility, that NEPAD as the social and economic development program for Africa has actually been hard at work over the last 16 years to try and create a Pan-African framework, strategy and structures to encourage 55 countries to work together towards a common African vision and goal. So many of you may or may not know NEPAD. Can I just see a show of hands? How many of you know the history or know about NEPAD, heard of it, forgot about it? Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm glad to see many of you heard about it. I often to this day get asked the same question, is NEPAD dead? And I'm just pleased to tell you that it's not dead. It's very much alive. And it has gone through various transformations and evolutions. And at this point, I'm pleased to say that what it started out as was a voluntary group, a voluntary number of states adhering to the principles of NEPAD. And now it was integrated into the African Union as a technical program for social and economic development. Under the most recent leadership of Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who is the current chair of the African Union, he has now taken on the mantle to try and transform the African Union itself into a more effective and efficient and impactful organization. And so the whole AU structure is currently being looked at, which means that NEPAD as a technical program will become the AU Development Agency and will take on all the AU programs on education, health, technology, etc. So I think that there's been an attempt to try and alleviate some of the duplicated efforts between the AU and NEPAD itself. And so all the developments and social and economic development programs will now be called the AU Development Agency, but still through the principles of the NEPAD frameworks. So NEPAD, what has it achieved over the last 16, 17 years? There are 5 focus areas on agriculture and food security, on economic and corporate governance, infrastructure and regional integration, capacity development and human capacity development, as well as management of natural resources. And this has looked at the 5 areas of what are the key issues to unlocking economic potential in the continent. The NEPAD Business Foundation, as I mentioned, chaired and founded by Dr. Khoza, brought together companies, predominantly South African but now Pan-African, to see how could private sector play a role in the implementation. There are many, and as we know, that's the role of policymakers to create these lovely frameworks, but where is the implementation? And so private sector has really largely played this role around implementing projects on the ground that will stimulate economies, grow the job opportunities, the enterprise development opportunities in order to alleviate poverty. So sustainable economic growth will lead to eventual eradication of poverty. So some of the projects that we've led under the NEPAD Business Foundation is, for example, under food security, we ran a program with funding from USAID and the Hewlett Foundation on the Biro corridor to integrate smallholder farmers into the commercial value chains. And this was a program across 4 countries, South Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi. And there were some really interesting models that I think as South Africans we could learn a lot from in Malawi around smallholder farmers and how to develop them. We also have at our core, when we looked at how and what the problems and challenges around investment in Africa were 16 years ago, was that Africa seemed to be a continent mired in darkness and controversy and bad governance. And so one of the first things we did as the MBF was to launch what we call the 4 covenants and declarations, which try to provide transparency for investors. So we had covenants on corporate governance, CSR, good audit and accounting practices, and anti-corruption and bribery. And this is linked to the African peer review mechanism, which was one of the first NEPAD programs that was launched. There are about 36 countries now that have gone through that process of basically playing open books on all aspects of its economy. And I like to believe that, for example, countries like Ghana and South Africa, to a degree, this has enabled more transparency for investors to understand the state of the nation in terms of its political, economic, social situation. And in that light, we started actually off in this room. I remember 11 years ago, one of the first programs we launched was the African Leadership Program. And as you may know, Dr. Kors is very passionate, has written 2 books about African leadership. And how do we define for ourselves what that African leadership should look like and not be merely dictated to by the colonial masters of how we should be running our own continent. And so we ran this program for a number of years here in partnership with Wits Business School. On the governance side, being core to attracting investment, we have a program called the African Corporate Governance Network, which is working in 19 African countries across the continent with the Institutes of Directors. And this is a capacity building program to try and help African businesses put in governance systems on boards, audits, your fiduciary duties, etc. So we're very proud of that project because corporate governance in some countries like Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire are relatively new notions. And they've literally only started the Institutes of Directors or governance institutions about a year ago. And so there's a lot of work that we still need to do on that level. One of the key challenges hindering trade and investment is lack of infrastructure. And here we have created, through the Africa Infrastructure Program, an alignment with NEPAD's PIDA, which stands for Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, where there are 52 priority cross-border projects that we have focused on. We are predominantly working in the Southern and East African region through a project called the North-South Corridor Rail. And I have to just highlight this as one of our flagship projects because this project has been on the cards for the last 8 to 10 years, and not any other single institution has been able to pull this together because it's so complex. There are 5 countries involved. This rail line runs from Durban through to DRC, and there are 5 rail operators involved. And as a mining company, if you're wanting to ship your copper from DRC to Durban, you have to get 5 quotes from 5 different rail operators at different rates and not be sure when it would get to the port. And so the opportunities that this 4,000 kilometer stretch of rail, if it is reliable, efficient, and cost effective, we were able to move more cargo onto the rail and off the roads. And so the NEPAD Business Foundation, by default, became the project sponsor of this because we act as a neutral facilitator and coordinator between government and private sector to address these barriers to trade. And we have completed a pre-feasibility study, and without having any money to rehabilitate the infrastructure or investment in the project itself yet, we have managed to, through bringing those 5 rail operators together around the table, to create the trust between them, and we've reduced the transit time from 15 days down to 7.5 days. We've enabled Transnet to sign an MOU with Zambia Rails. As some of you may know, years back, there was some bad blood between the two countries because of failed concession agreements. So it's a huge feat that we've achieved, that they're now actually partnering together. And so even as recent as yesterday, we held a workshop in Zambia to really look at creating a one-stop shop for this North-South Corridor Rail, that customers could get pricing, they could get scheduled train services, they could get an uninterrupted movement of goods and services across 5 countries. So that, I think, is a massive feat that we have achieved that no one else has been able to. We also, while we are trying to promote private sector investment, understand that at the public sector level, if there's lack of capacity, none of these projects would get out the door. Many of you know that when governments issue tenders, they get cancelled and reissued and cancelled. And so the companies are getting fatigued because you're spending about R1 million trying to put together these bids, only for it to be cancelled. So it's a huge amount of money that's wasted in investments. And we are also playing the advisory role to governments, so that before they issue these tenders, they come to us and ask us, would private sector be interested in these projects? And we would give them advice. And we have recently, last year, started PPP, Public-Private Partnership Training. It's a World Bank accredited course, so that we can help the public sector understand how to develop these PPP projects. And then, so basically we have about 6 different programs. I'm going to speak about the last 2. One of our most innovative projects is a recently launched program called the Mine Water Coordinating Body, which is South Africa specific. And that we are working with 6 of the big mining companies in Mpumalanga. And as you know, there's big coal fields there. And most of those mines have a life of mine for 30 to 40 years. And what happens is the mine is responsible for rehabilitating the land and the water to certain levels. And when the mines close down, those communities become ghost towns, because the communities have been heavily reliant on the mining activity for livelihoods. So we're taking a new approach, working together with DMR and DWS, to look at how do we bring companies together to collaborate on a regional mine closure plan. And the waste from the mine is being repurposed for green energies, and it's very, very exciting. So, for example, we have already planted 60 hectares of land of maize in an Anglo-American property, using waste saline water from the mines for agriculture. And what's very interesting, it has yielded double of what you would have using normal water. So we are partnering with Water Research Commission and University of Pretoria to do testing on the water, and then trying to create a second economy in agriculture, renewable energies that's left behind when the mines close, so that community doesn't become a ghost town. And then last but not least, we work at a SADC level with the SADC Secretariat to coordinate and bring the voice of private sector to help implement the SADC industrialization strategy. And the whole aim, as you may know, even Pan-African, in order for us to prosper, we need to add value to our raw materials. And there's a big, ambitious industrialization strategy, which requires private sector to lead and implement and invest in these manufacturing and value-adding capacities. So we have hosted over the last 3 years SADC Industrialization Week. We're looking at cross-border value chains in mining, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, and the FMCG sector, on how do we integrate smallholder farmers, SMEs, and taking our raw materials from one country and processing it in a neighboring country, so that by the time you've added value to the goods, it's worth 1,000-fold more. And so this is really, for the first time, and it's been attempted over many years, for private sector to engage with SADC, and now we have a platform to do that. So that's just a lot of detail. There is a lot more that I could tell you about, but needless to say that obviously me being in it, we are driving NEPAD. It is very much alive. It is set to grow, and I think probably one of our downfalls is that the communication on it has not been broad and sufficient enough. But there is hope, and I'm very optimistic about this Pan-African vision coming to reality, And just before I end, just to say that you may have seen recently in March in Rwanda at the AU meeting, the African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Area was signed by 44 countries out of the 55 in Kigali, which is aiming to establish a single market for goods and services across Africa. So I think that that is really positive in trying to get an integrated Africa that's taking ownership of its challenges and trying to deliver using African models. Also, just to say that from an AU level, there is also a change in the way that the AU is funded. So many of you may know that unfortunately the AU's budget, 61.7% of its budget, is funded by the EU, USA, UK, and the World Bank. And each of the African countries are supposed to contribute to the operational and activity costs of the AU, but because it hasn't for many generations, the AU is obviously then at the influence of these funders. And so I think what's encouraging is that we are trying to take Africa back. The AU has approved, and heads of states have agreed, that 0.2% of a levy on selected imports into Africa will be used by those countries to put into the AU's operational costs. Already 14 states are already collecting these levies and contributing to the AU. So there's a lot going on, and there's still, as Dr. Koza mentioned, a lot of interest, particularly from the East in Africa. They are currently the third largest investor in the continent, behind the USA and EU. And we have to take ownership of what we want and define the model of how investors come to Africa, and we have to set our own guidelines of what our expectations are. So I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynette. I think that's a practical manifestation of practical involvement of South Africa in Africa. And I must commend the NEPAD Business Foundation for having been as sustainable as they have been, because a number of other initiatives have sort of withered on the vine pretty quickly. I know of one energy company that in the late 1900s to the early 2000s had extended its hand to a number of countries on the continent, expanding from 9 to 34 and establishing a real working relationship, but has since, I think, gone absent where the continent is concerned. So for the good work that you are doing, we must commend you. And I am delighted that I was party to the establishment. But Lynette was involved right at the beginning and has been the common thread throughout all of the initiatives that she has actually referred to. You'll have occasion to ask questions a bit later on. May I suggest that we move on to Professor William Gomede, whose major area of focus is governance, but not just governance, but ensuring that democracy works in Southern Africa and further afield on the continent.
All of the great transformations, regional transformations, has always been with often, and this is after the Second World War, with one country at its center. I mean, we often talk in South Africa particularly about the developmental stage. Now, if you imagine what happened with the developmental stage, immediately after the Second World War, Japan played almost like a golden goose role, where Japan's development in that region actually elevated a whole lot of other countries, the South Koreans, the Singapores, the Taiwans. So from a South African point of view, from a strategic point of view, that is a role we'll have to play in Africa as a golden goose, because no other region has developed without one core country really going out and develop and pulling a whole range of other countries with it. So that's the very first point I want to make, and I'll leave it, and I'm going to come back to that point. Now, the second point is just from from an integration point of view. If you think what's happening in the world now, the trade system is collapsing because of Trump. Now, the only way out for Africa, from an African point of view, is actually to draw closer to each other, because we're entering a world of trade uncertainty and a redrawing of trade relationships between different countries and so on. That's the first challenge from our point of view. It's also a challenge from a South African point of view, strategic point of view, as Cyril Ramaphosa takes over. But there's a third challenge, before we even get to this integration of Africa. Now, historically, comparatively, integration often only works if there's a practical, one practical infrastructure project holding it together. Think of the EU. Steel and coal was the beginning after the Second World War of the European Union. So there has to be one project. So if you look at the African transformation projects, what has it been? Since the OAU and so on, has been around politics. Now, politics, unfortunately, in the long term, cannot hold together an industrialization project. It hasn't happened unless we want to be the first. And we don't, and it doesn't, we don't, the substance, the ingredients are not there. So if we want to do this African free trade, this integration, not if we want to, we have no choice. Because just from an African development point of view, just from a practical point of view, it makes sense for us to integrate, because if we have high tariffs in other countries, in the industrial countries, in the US and in Europe, because we're entering a period now of tit-for-tat trade, where the US is going to lift, then other countries are going to lift tariff barriers also. So where do we fit in? The best way for us as Africans to deal with the situation is to try to trade with each other. At least from a strategic point of view, most of our products may not be competitive when it gets into Europe or so on, or because of the high tariff barriers and other issues. There's other kind of things. There are things like sanitary standards and those sort of things. But if we trade with each other, we decide from an African continental industrial policy at the heart of a free trade agreement. So it's not just a free trade agreement on its own, it's not going to fly because there's politics. So what we need to do is anchor something. Either we could say we run a continental infrastructure project that runs, from Cape to Cairo on a grid, and we build around it, and so on. And then what we do is one country can produce one thing, the strength, and another country something else, and inputs and so on. So, a real practical plan. Because integration, unfortunately, as I say, historically, and from a research point of view, comparatively, there has to be a project that holds us together. Now, there's a couple of obstacles. The very first obstacle, if you look at what happened since the global financial crisis and then the Eurozone crisis, most of both the industrial countries and the developing countries, the big emerging powers that we talk about, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Indians, and so on, they've come to Africa to reboot their own economies. Okay. So that immediately becomes a challenge to even an integration project. Because what does it mean from an integration project, which is already an obstacle? Because why would the Chinese, why would the Indians be interested in an African integration project? Because the African integration project will be against their own interests. They need a divided Africa in order to strike good deals for them and to get weak deals, and so on. So that's a very, very first thing. So from a strategic point of view, if you're China and if you're Brazil and if you're India, Africa is a place where you have to go because cheap deals, easy negotiations. I've looked, and we're coming out with a book in September on BRICS in Africa. And if you just look at all of the trade deals between the Chinese or Brazilians and so on, and African countries, it's so terrible that you wonder where the skills in the countries, where the academics, or because it really is bad deals. And so on. I'll just take you an example. If you take Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe a couple of years ago went to China and he supposedly was it Outlook China type of policy. And he came back to Harare in Zimbabwe, and he made all sorts of announcements. But I just tell you, if you ever have an opportunity, if you just to have a look at a deal, I mean, just one part of the deal, and then there's a lot of other terrible stuff in the deal. One part of it is in return, for example, for a loan, which was not even much. We're talking about years, the equivalent of some, 2-3 billion US dollars over the long term, is that every output from state-owned companies and state-owned mines has to go to China. I mean, and that labor standards and where the Chinese companies are operating should be lifted. So almost like two sets of rules. So that is the type of things, within the deals. So how is that a deal then? From an industrial point of view, it just means whoever takes over from Robert Mugabe, whatever new government will have to go back and renegotiate, or try to renegotiate, because these sort of deals, to renegotiate, is talking about 20, 30, 40 years, and so on. But let me get back, just from a strategic point of view, from a South African point of view, I mean, it's really going to mean, if we want to be the anchor, and we've got all of the attributes to be the anchor, two ways. One, for our own industrialization. Because you just think about it, we've been deindustrialized as a country. I mean, we have the last 20 years. And the thing is, once you deindustrialize, it really is very difficult to catch up. Now, the problem about, in the period that we live now, I mean, people talk about a fourth industrial revolution, but if you really analyze what it means, is technology develops so quickly, so a country now that's left behind now may never in perpetuity catch up. That's the one. But although there is, of course, the counter, that if we use technology now, we could actually leapfrog development. So it's two sides of the coin. So where do we want to be? Do we want to use the technology, but then we have to be strategic, or do we want to be left behind? And I just give you just a graphic example of being left behind. Why did colonialism happen? Both here and in Africa and in Southeast Asia and in Latin America. It happened because Africa was left behind in the first industrial revolution, and Southeast Asia, the Chinese during that period, and in Latin America also. In terms of, so what it means is industrial countries, to refer to the industrial revolution, actually acquired a technology and the knowledge and the skill set, which, countries in Southeast Asia and countries in Africa and Latin America could not compete, and that's why we were colonized. I mean, and for me, that's a very important fact from a strategic point of view of how to decide how do we act, and so on. Even for me, I would even say the beginning of the developmental stage in Southeast Asia after the Second World War was really, I think, the brilliance. I mean, the absolute brilliance would have been the Japanese when they lost the Second World War, and they made their own analysis why they lost the Second World War, that they came to the realization the reason why they lost the Second World War was they lost out on technology with the US. That was a very important point to make, and on the economic side. So not necessarily on the firepower side, but on the technology side and on the economic side. So their response then, so what we see, that great transformation from the late 1940s, until the end of the 1970s was based on that. And the response of the countries in the neighborhood, the South Koreans and the Taiwanese responded as, again, the brilliance of their response to copy exactly what the Japanese were doing. And the response, it was a virtual cycle. And I would even make an argument that the Chinese, there are two responses why they've had the last 3 decades the kind of economic growth rate is because they responded initially to the Japanese growth rate and the rise of Japan. And then secondly, the competition with the Soviet Union, because you remember from a left point of view, there were two axes in the Cold War within communism. First the Soviet communism that South African Communist Party, the ANC, was aligned with, and then there was the Chinese, a couple of other countries that was competing, and so on. And the Chinese response was that also their own realization that, on economics, they have to try to win the war on economics, and secondly on technology. and so on. And the African response, unfortunately for us, after the Second World War, we didn't respond to any of it. What did we do? Those countries that did responded by arming themselves. I mean, that is really going nowhere, and so on. So, I mean, why did I go about the roundabout way? Is just to show you two things from a strategic point of view that we have to do as South Africa. I mean, if you want to make the new dawn, to try to make it materialize, and we want to re-industrialize, because we've now de-industrialized, then we have to analyze, what does Africa want? What are the products? What do they want? Do they want fridges? Do they want stoves? And then we have to produce it. And we have to produce it cheaply. Then we have to analyze, what do they need? What is the infrastructure deficit? What can we contribute? If they don't have rail, do we have rail? We've had 150 years of building rail. Can we do the rail? And re-industrialize here, and so on. But also politically, will also mean we will have to respond differently politically. We cannot say, look, we don't want to behave as a big brother, we're going to be quiet, we can be humble. If we're going to do that, our lands are going to be eaten by the Chinese and by the Indians and by the Brazilians. What we will have to do, we'll have to be proactive, and we're going to have a map of Africa in our head, and we're going to have to say, who do we have to engage with? Who do we have to partner with? And we'll have to be ruthless when we do that, and so on. And that is really what we'll have to do. And then maybe lastly, what we will have to need to do is to partner with business. Government-business partnerships, government-business, civil society partnerships, because nowhere historically in the last 100 years has a country moved from underdevelopment to industrial without that partnership. It hasn't happened. Historically, again, unless we want to say we will be the first, where it's only the state that drives a development, it hasn't happened. And so we're going to have to get their partnership together. So what would it mean in practical terms? If a Transnet, for example, goes into another African country to build, to whatever, partnership with business, partnership with the banks, partnerships with the intellectuals, and so on. I mean, if you look, again, if you have the opportunity to Google and you look how the Chinese enter a country, it's a state-owned company or a private company, it's intellectuals, it's the government, it's a package into a country. It's like a supply, it's a chain, from the top to the bottom. First on the ideas, the research. I mean, if you think about what's happening in China, only in the Foreign Affairs Department of China, there's 100,000 experts on Africa. So people know more about African countries than we here know about them. So that's the group first. Start off an analysis, and then comes the states, then come in the politics, and the president at the end needs to do the last bit of push, if a push needs to be done. So that's really how we will have to look strategically if we want to use Africa to re-industrialize South Africa, but also to lift growth in Africa. And because we also have to see that our allies and BRICS as allies, but also as competitors. So then it means we'll have to rethink our strategy. What does it mean to be an ally and a competitor at the same time?
I think we'll have occasion to discuss that. Integration, very, very importantly, it's one of the issues that I've tried to grapple with. The biggest problem that we have as a continent is that of allowing ourselves to be a continent in fragments. When China comes here, they don't come as a country, they come as a continent. China is a continent. But for most of us, it comes across as though it was a country. And when it comes here and negotiates with Angola, already Angola is isolated and weak. But if they were negotiating with Southern Africa, and the Southern Africa that works together in tandem and in solidarity, then even China will show a bit of respect. The tragic thing is that even a small mountain kingdom called Lesotho wants to engage in a tango with China. Imagine the two dancing. There's no question as to, I mean, if you have an elephant and a mouse in tango, if anything goes wrong in that tango, there's no question as to who will be trampled over. So there is a sense in which we actually have to, I mean, integration is not optional. It's a must. It's the Hobson's choice. Even as SADC, we will begin to make a bit of sense, even as a market. Even if our claim to fame was we consume. Now, if you're SADC, you eat big. If you're Swaziland, you eat very, very little and nobody cares. So there is a sense in which we have to develop a sense of substantiality as the South, as East Africa, as West Africa, even Central Africa, where you had questionable leaders masquerading as providing leadership. As a Maghreb region, integrated, unless we actually begin to view ourselves as a continent against a continent, we will continue to just tag along and be milked. Prof, may I request you to consolidate and expand?
It would be very difficult for one to consolidate what is very distinct position, direct experience from NEPOD, and also a very extensive research on industrialization. So I do think that it would help if I were to just come from a different angle in order to enrich this particular discussion. I was looking at the topic South Africa in Africa, the importance of readopting a Pan-African mindset. And I was happy that you had to entitle readopting. It's the same thing as South African reconciliation, as if there is a second reincarnation of a conciliation that ever took place before. There is no time when South African business ever had a Pan-African mindset per se. We would have to be very honest and start afresh to say what would it take to have a Pan-African mindset. Let me escort that logic in order to reflect why I come to that particular observation. Most of our business ventures into the continent, your MTNs, your ShopRites, your Vodacom, your Standard Bank, and so forth, have been there largely because of instrumental reasons. What would be the bottom line? What's the market segment? Rather than an ideological intrinsic reasons. It's a very calculated involvement of what can I get. Now this misalignment of the body and soul has policy and intellectual implications. In this form, South Africa has always been tentatively African in a doubtful manner. The first European settlers saw it as a geographical location in Africa, but the soul was elsewhere. The second, the new black business and political elite had this notion of South African exceptionalism. We are not like them. Hence, some of them, when they were being deployed as diplomats in Africa, they took that as a demotion of a certain kind, soul-searching, what did I do? Not to end up in Germany or USA. It was a punishment. So here now you have the former and the current combined in their suspicion of this thing called Africa. And with a few like Tawombege, isolated in their song, that when removed from power, the tune is no longer sung. So I think we should start from that brutal honesty so that we just go into a clean slate. That Dr. Khoza and a few others may have this passion. They are a miserable few. The rest, it doesn't even, they are speaking in tongues. They are not understood. So I think, to me, let me explain these fault lines. South Africa and Africa are two entities with often two different ideas about themselves. So we have to work on that. The second fault line, even Africa had tried to establish the sixth region, the diaspora, but we have hardly ever conceptualized and utilized that. Another fault line. Then Africa is probably the only continent segmented according to the phones, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone. I don't know what the other phone is, but it's different phones. In fact, in South Africa, I think it's even worse. We may even have an Afrikaner phone and Anglophone within the same. With anything Pan-African being a junior player. Now, as if the phones are not enough, the neck bone of Africa is painful. It looks east, it looks west. It hardly ever looks in itself. Sometimes now we have this anxiety of China coming. We have even forgotten that Europe and USA never left. So we are in the fourth or fifth scramble for Africa. And you'll find that a scholar coming from USA and from, Europe will say, what do you think of this problem of China? As if their problem has disappeared. They are all problems of different sorts. Then when Chinese come, they say, what do you think of the West? So until Africa stops the schizophrenic existence, where they are either that or that, and they start thinking about themselves in the most strategic manner, then we will begin to talk. As if that is not enough, another fault line. In South Africa, there's such profound mistrust between business and government and civil society. When Shoprite or MTN goes to West Africa, their meeting point with government is when some of their workers are detained by some rebels. They say, where is our embassy? There is no common ideological or philosophical common ground. So that in itself, even within the country itself. So the lack of shared values, the lack of shared common destiny, the lack of an appreciation of national interest is also adding to that. As if that is not enough, the fault line between big business and small business. Can you imagine the fragmentation of our business? NAFCOG, BBC somewhere, and then the big businesses. When they go to Africa, they are not speaking the same language. They would need a translator between them. So those are some of the things that we ought to find. Then the intellectual exile and alienation. It's yet another thing. On average, much thinking and policy thinking in this country is done greatly by your white scholars. Let's be honest about it. And blacks consume that knowledge. The policy thinking is done by consultants and so forth. Government has not given space to your African intellectuals to say what would be your input. So we generally are an alienated lot. I often say we are an intellectual exiled group until we are returned to the mainstream. Now, can you imagine the policy thinking and what feeds it? And those who have stake, who may even have some Pan-African idea, are somewhere in the margins. You have to read in the newspapers about what is happening in the policy chambers. Then the last one of the fault lines is the reluctant leadership. South Africa still has the scar of what was the P.W. Botha's policy in Southern Africa, the total onslaught. After that, we were so meek that Nyerere had to remind former President Thabo Mbeki that we were helping you so that you help us, you do have the means. Now, because we are so reluctant not to provide leadership, we often fear and tiptoe moving forward. And even worse, that more recently we had these challenges of leadership and the policy thinking on Africa. We were dealing with case-by-case basis on a piecemeal. But just to run through 3 points and then I keep quiet. The African Renaissance success was the clarity of ideological trust, conceptual and theoretical direction, benefiting from your Pan-African generations of intellectual traditions, whether it was Africans in the diaspora, whether it was your Marcus Garveys, your Du Bois, your Nkrumah in the continent and so forth, born out of struggles where people were beginning to envision an alternative society. But when now Thabo Mbeki left, in South Africa, policies are not declared dead, they fade away. When the leader leaves, because the policies are so personalized, it's more like you have a copyright. When your intellectual property, when you leave office, you leave with your goods. So was the case with the African Renaissance. When to Derko, you almost can see diplomats, career diplomats, fearing to even mention the word because it could just make them, it could be career limiting, to quote the intellectual property of the previous person. In Africa, they were warming up and embracing African Renaissance. In South Africa, we're running away from it. So many African countries became foster parents of the African Renaissance when it was orphaned this side. So that's one thing. The second one, the success of that policy was when you had key regional leaders having personal chemistry and relationship. Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo, Bouteflika, yes, were there, and Meles Zenawi. Now we lack that. We lack that chemistry. If Ramaphosa were to say to Kenyatta and were to look for the next leader in Nigeria and so forth, they have that chemistry. They meet with Paul Kagame and others who seem to have some idea of what life could be like after 5 years, because I think the problem of now, leaders are thinking in 5-year terms, next election. The Nkrumahs were thinking 100 years. The Thabo Mbekis were saying the 21st century will be the African century. Right now, I think most of the leaders are thinking annual report to table to parliament. There's no vision. The death of leadership. And I think I would go on, but also our peculiarity as South Africa. The moment you say Pan-African, in South Africa, people start thinking Sobukwe. They are not even sure. Is it the PAC resurgence? So we need to first cleanse our minds. Just to be clear that we're left alone not understanding that Pan-Africanism is not PAC. So that kind of education, I think, will be important even in the introduction of our history subjects. I would have spoken more, but I guess let me just stop here. Thank you.
The ability to see things from even above the trees, but at the same time have a lethal kick should anything want to disturb you down here. So given time, Prof. Madoda would actually have spoken about the Indlulamiti scenarios. We would invite you to actually they can actually access that in our website. I tagged along because I wanted to listen to his wisdom as he was leading this whole thing, as part of what they call the leadership group, whatever that meant. But a fair amount of work has been done focusing on South Africa between now and 2030. What could possibly happen? What are the scenarios? So what you had here looked at the continent, but if you wanted to drill a little deeper into what is likely to happen in South Africa in the next decade. May I suggest that we now engage in conversation? You can ask questions from anyone and leave me aside, I'm just a compere. No, but feel free to ask questions of all four of us, and then we will move to a conclusion following that.
Professor Kumedi said there is when you referred to the BRICS, you spoke about the fact that you're both a partner and a competitor, and that those issues can be a part of what is problematic to that relationship. Now, coming to trying to form a united Africa, you're finding that you still need to deal with that same issue of competitor and partner. So how do we envisage Pan-Africanism and the role of South Africa in that regard? Because for me, I think this is one of the key problems, because as South Africa is being referred to as Big Brother and all those notions that Professor Somadoda Figen highlighted, it's reality. And that fact of the fact that when you expand the borders, countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, Botswana, they become easily the market for South African goods. So how do you then make sure that there is some development that happens in those countries that sustains and makes them interested in this partnership?
I am a businessman. I'm an accountant by profession. I'm practicing in Fort Lauderdale for the past 18 years. And currently, I'm the CEO of the Institute of Business Advisors. I think this background will help you to understand where I come from. When I was the CEO of the institute, when I was the chairperson of the institute that I am currently the CEO thereof, I have always mentioned, I think it was during the presidency of President Thabo Mbeki, in all the meetings, I sounded like a stuck record for those who know what a record is, because we no longer have them now. Zimbabwe, next door, they excelled with their education. But during that time, our people went to Canada, like even the Companies Act that we are using now comes from Canada. It resembles the Canadian model. And they went to Australia, you name all these other countries. And as a business person, I'm also into construction in Fort Lauderdale. And electricians that I'm using are coming from Malawi. And builders that I'm using are coming from Mozambique. But still, and I believe I'm a Pan-Africanist, and still we, even today, now as I speak, we're not consolidating SADC and use the skills that we have. We know in Africa, as now, that Kenya is leading in IT or ITC. But we're not looking at that. We know that Nigeria, there's oil. We're not worried about that. And the list goes on of things that should be uniting us to do exactly what the panel has been saying today. But we're not doing that. Now, coming back to, I'm operating in a township. And we see what havoc drugs are doing. And we know that there are councillors in the township. And every corner of South Africa, there is a ward. Now, if you go and ask the ward councillor, do you know how many people are unemployed in your ward? They don't know. They don't know where you come from. Why do you even ask that question? How many businesses do you have in your ward? And the list goes on. And therefore, the problem is not that big, it's just that we trying to play out there and leave the problems down here.
We'll take that largely as a commentary, and it's very, very practical commentary, which might be evocative, not as a question, but as commentary. Thanks for giving us a Southern African perspective and a very, very local perspective. Because the challenges are actually that pervasive.
BRICS issue is, it's not to break from BRICS, but just to be a little bit more smarter. To sit down, if they are our friends, first we'll have to understand, I think it's, the sentiment expressed there, we have to say, what is our economic situation, our own situation? What do we need to do? If blacks are the majority, they're unemployed, they have no skills, they have low skills. Okay, that's the first analysis. Now we have to say, whatever trade deal that we engage with, how do we get those blacks who are unskilled, low skilled, and so on, into jobs? So that must be the first part of the trade. So then one has to negotiate to say, how's that going to be possible? So we start off from somewhere, not in the midst, sort of in a fantasy world, what we want, but what's our reality? Then our second reality is in terms of how do you soak up the majority of people who are unskilled and low skills? How do you? It's only that you can only soak up them into the manufacturing. Now, unfortunately, the manufacturing is there where the Chinese are pushing us out. If you think about Israel, where was it in 1994? When I was reporting for the first, Israel was still vibrant and so on. Tools were made and all sorts of things. And you don't need to have high skills to do. Now that it's all killed off. So a trade deal will have to speak to that. Absolutely has to speak to that, because that's how we soak the unemployed quickly into. So if we're going to strike a deal, for example, just think about this. We try to create with Mercosur, with Brazil, a free trade area between SADC, South Africa, SADC, and Brazil. Now think, what is producing Brazil? What is Brazil competitive? They're producing cars exactly like we're producing cars in P in East London. I mean, isn't there obvious competition there? So if we're going to strike a deal, we have to understand what they are producing there and how they're going to kill our industries here. So at least we negotiate and say, look, part of our deal, you're not going to enter the car space here. I mean, the same with the chicken. I mean, can you imagine, we all grow up, I mean, we grow up raising chicken, every black person, well, at least most majority. Yeah. Then we have to import chickens from Brazil. Does it make sense from a trade sort? Isn't it, if people in the rural areas, if we need chickens, blacks eat chicken, then we can't have a trade deal where we have people importing frozen chickens there. I mean, there's an opportunity lost there. And so let me say that from a practical point of view. You know, the way we were colonized, and there is opportunity for us in the way so South Africa was colonized as part of the New World, the Brazils and so on, the time. So that's, 200, 300 years before all of the other African countries were colonized. So this society, by the time in the 1800s, when other African countries were colonized, there was a society here formed, whether we liked it or not. So what it means is, we've got, this is one of the most diverse societies on earth. From a large Malay community, a large Indian community, a large indigenous Chinese community that came here more than 150 years ago. Now we also have a large in the region. I mean, Africans who are coming, people are coming from Eastern Europe. So what is the opportunity in there? From a trade point of view, what is the opportunity? The first opportunity, if you're going to have indigenous Chinese communities being here, South African, as anyone who's a South African here, if you're going to negotiate with the Chinese, is you're going to use the strength of their capacity immediately. I mean, it seems very obvious. That's the first thing. The second thing, if we're going to then trade with the world, then we have to trade with what our strengths are. If this is the diverse, then that's how we have to trade around the world also. So what we need to do is balance Africa, but Africa our core, but then around the world where our strengths are. And so on. So logically, from a point of view, I mean, it's sad that unfortunately, politically, what we've done the last 10 years, we've just gone along with BRICS. I mean, we haven't been a player there. We haven't been a player. I'll tell you what I've been a player. Just think about it. 3 years ago, the Russians in BRICS proposed. You know what they proposed? I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. They proposed to have an alternative, to use gold as an alternative way. I mean, it's part of the US to counter the US dollar. Now think about, we are traditionally, this country, gold, that we don't even have an opinion or think to that. Historically, we were, a couple of years ago, a major gold producer. So tactically and strategically, we must know everything about gold, not the politics, how it works, everything. And so obviously, you can't have the Russians to come up with a strategy like that. So that's what I say, what it means to be. When we're in a trade grouping, it is the world's, unfortunately, is a tough space. In a way, so the moment we don't use the strength of our capacity, we lost. And if we unfortunately, we lose this battle. So, we must have sleepless nights, because if we lose this battle, this is a fourth industrial revolution. We're not going to recover, unfortunately. It's a repeat here of the 1800s. This is a repeat. This is a historical moment here. So, so politics is not the only thing. There have to be a technical, strategic negotiations. We're at a cusp here. And so, just again, think about, if we have Nigerians in this country, why don't we use the Nigerians as we enter Nigeria? They know Nigeria. They're here. Take them and say, well, you are faced, you go and negotiate on our behalf here.
I think most of policymakers, when they are asked, let's establish best practice, subconsciously they think, let's go to the West. As a consequence, we are in the top 15 per capita expenditure on education, but our results are the worst.
Yes.
We're not asking ourselves questions. Why would a country like Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Ghana spend a fraction and yet produce so much? It's those basic questions, but our subconscious reluctance to believe that Africa is anything of value is that when you say best practice, before you say anything, Japan, Germany, USA, just almost program, that's how we're wired. So we have to unlearn that and interrogate those default thinking patterns. I took an idea which I thought was fantastic when I coordinated the development of the Mthatha Airport. Went to the Minister of Transport to sell the idea that Rwanda is one of the first few countries that have developed drone airport. And they are delivering medical supplies to the villages. And I said, I met with the commissioner, can we go there and so forth? And you could just almost tell the officials, yeah, Rwanda. Yeah, no, we think it's a good idea, but Rwanda. So when I was talking about those mental blocks, I was not trying to caricature the situation. They are real. Now, if you said, let's go look at ICT in Kenya, not even Bangalore in India, what about Silicon Valley? Because besides everything, we love to travel. Having worked in some of South African delegations when we go to engage, whether it was the World Heritage Committee or a small country, they understand what their national interest is. They meet their ambassador. They debrief. They meet before they leave. South Africa is the most traveling country in any conference. It has the largest delegations, except that what combines them in that delegation is the flag sitting before them. No understanding of what national interests are. I've participated in some of the BRICS think tank. Whenever we got stuck, Russians said, give us a moment to consult our principals. Chinese did the same. Brazilians. South Africans, when you ask the four of us sitting in that meeting, what will be our position? No, we already know. So we are a country that is driven by autopilot and the spirit of the moment. No strategic thinking. In those World Heritage conferences, I can tell you that a small country like Senegal could outsmart South Africa. Because we went there, one Department of Environmental Affairs officials, they say this is our mandate. Department of Arts and Culture said, no, this is ours. What is our country position? No, wait, we are too busy to even think. So we just have to go to basics, humble ourselves, and say we have not started thinking like a country with national interest, clear objectives, and then there will be a chance. But also in this, coming back to what Prof was saying, we'll have to reflect very carefully about the fourth industrial revolution because it's a trend you can't avoid. One hand, Africa is the youngest with a bulging youth population. And we're about to add another 300 million in a space less than 30 years. Now, one of our biggest challenges is to create jobs through labor-intensive industrialization. But the coming trend of fourth industrial revolution, it's more about replacing some of the jobs which are routine. Then you ask yourself, will our education system prepare our youth to take advantage of these changes, or will it complicate if we're not thinking very carefully about its implications? Thank you.
I want to just add to what both of you have said, but in my experience as a South African-born indigenous, been here 3 generations, often people question me, why is this Chinese-looking person, so passionate about Africa, but literally because I was born here.
They may suspect you came to represent BRICS.
I'm not a Chinese spy. I'm not a Chinese spy, but I really am passionate about Africa. The comments that you've made, all of you, is really relevant. And as a South African representing NEPAD, traveling in the continent, in the last, and though we were started at Becky's request, the last few years of the former rule, let's say, has been extremely challenging because I go out into other African countries. We are warmly embraced. We are respected. We are acknowledged. We can get meetings with the ministers, within a day. And you speak to one minister, he picks up the phone and says, so-and-so from NEPAD's here, can you meet them tomorrow? And it's been amazing that they are so open, in particularly Zambia, Ghana, the countries you mentioned, so open to working with the private sector. And yet in our own country, I've sent letters to ministers that still have not been responded to now 2 years later. So we cannot, our own country, as South Africa, who's supposed to be leading, does not have the vision, coordination around Africa. And I think that it's really sad, even the way that President Mbeki had initially set up, that in every single department there had to be a NEPAD unit. It's pretty much disintegrated. Only DT and Dirk are having 1 or 2 NEPAD staff as such. So I think that it's sad because South Africa has lost out. And that is why most of our programs that we do are outside of South Africa, and I found it extremely pleasurable to work with other country governments, to be honest, than our own, and they're far more cooperative. And this has allowed us to help them innovate. So, for example, in Tanzania, we are doing a study on local economic development, where we are taking control, and we're saying, here we have many countries, China, Europe, America, coming to help us build infrastructure. But if we control the procurement, we're then able to dictate upon what terms they are going to build this infrastructure. So we are working with the Tanzanian Economic Empowerment Agency to look at the way that they are putting out their tenders. Right now, 10% of the value of that deal has to be allocated to local economic development, but it doesn't say what. So the companies come and they build a school and a clinic, I think that's enough. And we say, no, you need to look at that piece of infrastructure. So if it's a large rail project, in that tender you have to specify of the 10%, you have to train how many engineers, how many trained signalers, what component of, even if it's nuts and bolts. And so we're working with them on crafting and reforming their procurement policy, which then they can put it out to anybody, and whoever wins that bid, whether it's Chinese, American, or even South African, you have to comply with that. And that's how you can take the power back, because you have the projects that they want, right? So we hopefully will take this up to the AU, and I don't know if many of you know, probably not many, that there is actually an AU Pan-African investment codes that have been developed, which are, in my view, a bit wishy-washy, and not substantive enough to dictate to investors what their obligations should be. Also, just your comments around Rwanda and the form of leadership, and I know President Kagame's style of leadership can be debated at length, but just suffice to say that the perception is created around Rwanda being well-governed, transparent, good investment, ease of doing business index, always in the top 5 in Africa. VW is setting up a new automotive plant that will be the size of Rossum. And only because Rwanda has the image of being well governed, despite the fact that it is landlocked, despite the fact that they're going to have to ship in certain parts. So I think governance still remains core to attracting investors. And again, just to reiterate on industrialization, we've debated this at length with SADC to say you've got this regional strategy and the vision that industrialization is going to create thousands of jobs and thousands of factories. The reality is those factories are going to be automated. So industrialization may lead to economic growth, but it will lead to jobless growth. And the same question, are we prepared with our youth in training them to be IT specialists so that they can develop the technology that's going to be needed and that we're not importing what we have seen in Ethiopia. And I know it's going through a lot of transformation at the moment, but it was very clear their country government has a very good strategy. Everybody knows, from the senior officials to the citizens, that the way that they're going to attract investment is on manufacturing to the point where they are going to be the sort of industrial hub for Africa. And they offer even investors. When our previous chairman, Stan Subramani, went to meet, we thought, with the Minister of in Foreign Affairs. He arrived there. There were 30 different government departments to receive him with different levels of officials to say, bring the business, we will help you, we will cut the red tape. Because even to the point that they have capped the salaries because they want to have provide cheap labor. And so you even find Chinese companies investing in Ethiopia and manufacturing shoes because Ethiopia is the biggest supplier of leather. They have the biggest population of cattle on the continent. That they're then exporting those manufactured shoes back to China. So that government is very clear on the investment strategy, which unfortunately we lack. So I think that just some perspectives on what is it going to take to create these centers of excellence. It is in the SADC strategy that each country, for example, Malawi, should be the center of excellence around malaria because they have the most experience in dealing with it. As you rightly said, some centers should be for manufacturing renewable energies, etc. So that is on the cards, but they're looking at private sector to implement it. And as you say, private sector themselves have a very ROI, what can we get out of it approach. So what we're doing as EBF is trying to bring the government, bring the business, create a common strategy, a common vision, and everybody understands their role and get projects done.
How do we get black township youth, specifically the entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, to start thinking a lot more Pan-African? Because this is the area of where we can encourage a lot more disruption and a lot more innovation for African problems. And as far as NEPA is concerned, how do we get a program on the ground that enables that to happen, where we start to think about disruptive innovation specifically for our African problems?
My question is on the fourth industrial revolution. It's been said that we need to retrofit a lot of the existing systems currently. So I want to know, what is the policy for Pan-Africanism with regards to global climate change?
I have a question for Lynette. A lot of the stuff that you talked about sounds very practical, but it still sounds like it's for people who are either heads of state or people who are running multinational corporations. So it sounds like big business stuff. And I imagine a lot of people are in this room and people who are running countries and running multinational corporations. Just a follow-up question on what he just spoke about. From NEPAD's perspective, where does small business feature in all of this stuff? I mean, there are things that we obviously can't engage with. We can't build dams as a starting point. But we can start with things like software and technology. What are you doing locally with that sort of stuff?
My name is Sarah Hamoura. I'm Egyptian. So that's why I'm having a different question. I'm talking about North Africa. And my question is to the three panelists and maybe precisely to the CEO of the NEPAD Business Foundation, is to what extent you see North African countries involved with and supporting the Pan-Africanism. especially after the revival of the African importance according to the political leadership in Egypt, Tunisia, and also Morocco nowadays. And the second question, maybe my generation also, the youth generation, I very much appreciate the role of business and economics and economic ties between the African countries, but when we can see, when should we expect to see something like Erasmus Europe, but maybe Mandela in Africa, so we can encourage more the connection between the African youth to exchange programs and to see each other, to know each other, and to understand each other properly, and also the different cultures between each other. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the East African delegation, and we have Faith here from Tanzania and from Kenya. And she has an interesting question, which I just will slot in. And it's, I think, Professor Gumede who talked about South Africa. And the question is, why does South Africa feel like the golden goose that should be the hub or the connector to Africa? Why not Kenya or Chad or some other weird country up north? So that's, yeah. And then mine is actually simple. Yeah, so mine is actually a simple one. And it's a question of the heart and the mind. I'm a believer, and I'm asking you, the whole panel, what do you honestly believe, and what do you honestly think is the future of Africa in the next 100 years? What do you really, really believe about the future of the continent? Yeah.
All that's been talked about is how do we do business like the West? Is there anywhere where somebody's contemplating doing business African way, so that we don't replicate all the problems the West has imposed, or all the problems China has? So say, how can Africans do business for themselves better?
I mean, I was in Tanzania two months ago giving the Nyerere lecture, and it was quite interesting because quite a number of young people were asking me in terms of, I mean, what do you do? I mean, my view, and it's very recent, in the sense that what we need to do is think about how do we bring young people into the economy, or rather, how do we have to start with small business. I mean, I'm increasingly starting to believe, but not small business, so we have to rethink, maybe two rethinks even before we get. The first rethink is the idea of entrepreneurship. We have to get that across, whether it's in South Africa, Tanzania, where, like entrepreneurship, and encourages. Now, because historically, from African, just think about all African liberation movements. Most of them are on the left, and so on. Very few believe in entrepreneurship. I mean, and so on. People think, oh well, big business, capitalism, outside, and so on. So that's already. So instinctively there hasn't been the embrace of entrepreneurship as the Chinese are doing, or as the Japanese and the South Koreans, and so on. So we really have to have that mindset, the first part of it. And secondly, we have to look at what is entrepreneurship. I mean, is entrepreneurship when you are a entrepreneur, you don't create. So entrepreneurship is when you create something. You produce, you come out. Not when I'm the middle man and the middle woman, and so on. So that's that, because it's not only here, unfortunately, it's across the continent. Yeah. So it just means that we will de-industrialize, because it means we're not supporting the real entrepreneurs. Back to the small business, I think most probably they may be our only option now. And why would I say that? Look at all of the economies all the economies that I mentioned, from the South Koreans to the Japanese and so on, 75% plus of the growth and employment and so on is created in small business. The same in Germany, 80%. So now but it would mean we have to relook what is small business. I mean, when I grew up, I sold potatoes in the trains. I mean, that's not entrepreneurship. So what entrepreneurship would be, of course, it's survival stuff and so on. Entrepreneurship is, can we create something which we then also export? When you export, we need to compete with others. So if you are saying, what is the African things? Are there things here that we can we can create, build, and then export, but from a small business point of view. That's the first angle. And so it's a relook then, it's a fundamental relook at entrepreneurship and what small business is, because that means that small business is not the way we looked at your Spartan shop. That's not small business. How do we turn that Spartan shop person who's already there, selling something, so it's in his blood or her blood, now turn that person into producing something? So maybe one option for us is to relook at black economic empowerment. I know for me is, I think increasingly now, it is a total waste of our money. And so if we look at it to say, can a new type of black economic empowerment be where we now get the young people, the small business, and so on, not big business, we're not creating big industrials, we're creating small ones. And we say, we're creating them from an industrial point of view. What would it mean to say, if you're a company, say if you're a Checkers, and you want to be BE, that the inputs into your company becomes from small business who are black. Now, this is not reinventing the wheel or coming up with something new. Mitsubishi, Samsung, all of those companies for decades from the 50s onwards, where Mitsubishi people sat in their homes and knitted the leather of the car seats. Now that's the sort of thing. So if we had taken that route of what B is we bring the young people to produce into inputs from their home or wherever they are sitting. The same for, if you're in a rural area, we grow up, you plant whatever you are planting, your sweet potatoes, whatever, can you bring it into the supply chain of Checkers, of Woolworths? Now that changes what it means now to empower. And that's what we have to rethink. And for me, that most probably is the only option going forward. I worked for 5 years as advisor to government, and there's a couple of projects I've worked on. One of it was to write the proposals in terms of how we could, it was commissioned by the PIC at the time, the PIC, the IDC, all of the development finance institutions, South African club together, and the SOEs, and then with the private sectors, and then we go as a country, as almost a team into countries. If Checkers goes invest, now potentially how it could work. So Checkers goes, let's say, to Nigeria to invest in there. Now can we have the supply chain, rural, black farmers produce into that supply chain? Okay. Now can we have from the development finance institutions the skills and everything? So industrialization is pretty practical. Unfortunately, the way we think about industrialization is very political. So the point is to how do we create into what we've got now? If, for example, what has happened the last 10 years, think about it when our companies moved out of a country. So if SAP Miller moved out and we clap hands and say, thank you very much, what happens? The manufacturing, the inputs the people have put in, is all destroyed. The R&D, everything is destroyed. So those are the sort of the tactical things that we have to take. So, so the things that we are destroying unthinkingly. So every act has consequences and we don't think about it tactically. And secondly, how do we rethink the policies that we currently have from a point of view is to say, we need to skill people, we need to give people jobs. Now, how does a policy work in that context? That must be the only way of looking at it.
So through the African Corporate Governance Network program, we actually held our conference in Egypt last year. And as I mentioned to you earlier, that in some parts of Africa, corporate governance is still a new notion, and particularly those countries that have gone through these uprisings are trying to redefine themselves, trying to define new governance structures, etc. And so in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, we're actually having our next conference in Algeria, is to leverage off this network of 19 other countries, institutes of directors, to replicate or share best practices between African countries on what they are doing and how to promote corporate governance. I also wanted to talk about entrepreneurship. piece, which is very important. Last year, we co-hosted with the African Union the 9th AU Private Sector Forum here in Johannesburg, and they rotate this in various parts of Africa. So this year actually was held in Egypt in May, April, May. But last year we hosted it here in Pretoria, and what we did was the whole focus was on the 4th Industrial Revolution. We invited about 25 technopreneurs, we called them technopreneurs, from across Africa. And what was astounding for me is the innovation that these young Africans have, and they have their own businesses. And just by bringing them together for 4 days, they were brainstorming. And we actually had a pitching competition where they could present their products, their companies, how much they needed, and what innovation it was. And I was really blown away that we initially, when we crafted the conference, was they were going to be like a side event, but they actually became the stars of the show. And I was just deeply inspired by the youth that we have. And so we had, for example, someone, an entrepreneur from Botswana, who could take plastics and recycle them into eco-bricks to build affordable housing. We then had another entrepreneur who, from Namibia, created these waterless toilets at an affordable cost. We had another entrepreneur from Zimbabwe who developed a pollution-free generator that could power up a household. And we had another entrepreneur from Tanzania who had a low-cost PC solution for the home. And when I gathered them in the room, I said, but you should be all doing business together. In this eco-brick house, you need a waterless toilet, you need a powerless generator, you need an affordable PC. And just the power of bringing them to the same place enabled them to start discussing how they could potentially do business with each other. And I definitely think we need more of that. Some of the innovations, particularly like even in Tanzania, there was a business who developed, he saw a gap in the market through smallholder farmers planting cashew nuts. But he saw that the farmers didn't really have any sort of knowledge on planting seasons. So he did a capacity building, developed an app that tells them this is the rainfall, this is when you must plant. And then through that app, which he got the data, he knew when they needed fertilizer and seed, and he would sell it to them and deliver it to them, and then agreed to buy the offtake. And then help them sell this onto the international market. So through an app, he was able to collect all this data and help smallholder farmers grow. And because, we have to be realistic as well, that we think not every single smallholder farmer is going to be a business person. The levels of literacy are not realistic for that. So work with the co-ops, etc. So there's amazing, in Cote d'Ivoire, another entrepreneur who uses drone technology to help, the initiative was to help his father manage his 6 plantations across all of Cote d'Ivoire. But instead of them traveling for 6 hours to these sites, he uses drone technology to get the information, manage the farms. And in fact, when he was here, MTN met with him and wanted to buy his technology. So there are amazing innovations, but you're right, we need a place that these entrepreneurs can be supported. And so through another program, through an EU-funded, and again, EU-funded program, and I don't know why Africans, we don't have our own funding, they're partnering with, Africa Development Bank, but it's with European Investment Bank as well, to create a Boost Africa Fund, where they are providing funding to finance SMEs, particularly around new technologies. So there's a lot of these funds around. My question to the EU was, it sounds great, but practically it's very hard to access that money. So there are many initiatives, and I think we have to focus on that you can't isolate small business from big business. They have to work together. And so the big businesses that have the capital and the resources to create production and manufacturing have to, and it is their responsibility to pull in the small businesses into their supply chains. And that is part of our strategy on the SADC industrialization work that we're doing.
If I had time, I would comment on entrepreneurship because I've been an entrepreneur from 1981. I have not had a boss. I've been unemployed, but I have not gone to bed hungry. And lately, after I got fired from a bank on account of old age, I went farming. and in 9 years flat, moved from being a small-scale farmer to being the second largest exporter of avocados to Europe. In 9 years flat. So, given time, we could actually go through this practically. What are the challenges? How do you overcome them, etc., etc. But we don't have the time. Today, we actually wanted to kind of tease out some of the ideas. You have people here who have also written, so I would suggest that you read them. I've tried to read as well. On the African challenge, there was a question there, why don't we do things the African way? Philosophically, you have to start somewhere. But if you're talking about trading, trading has gone very, very far afield. You cannot come up with buttering or something akin to that as an African. And one has had to write a fair bit about that. There's outside, if you're looking for a few ideas, there are a few books, some of which I wrote. You might like to access some of those. One is titled Let Africa Lead. And the philosophy there is meant to be African. Your departure point in whatever you do should be African. You should be anchored here. If you're Eurocentric and you're African, you will come across to other human beings as being hollow, as being totally disorientated, because you're actually living as somebody you are not. But be that as it may I ask the professor to conclude, and then perhaps I could just comment a little bit on the need for an Africa-wide vision.
Thank you very much, Program Director or Facilitator and fellow panelists. I do think that in the recent scenarios that we've come up with, consulting widely in the private sector, in the public sector, we came up with some of the key drivers that we should be looking at. One of those, which I think is very much relevant in this context, is the institutional and leadership capacity. You can have all ideas, dreams, wishes, everything. If you lack clear vision, leadership, driven by conviction rather than greed. If you lack capacitated institutions, you will not have the agility, the responsiveness. You'll have a situation where you submit a letter, 2 years later, it has not been responded to. And South Africa, unfortunately, has suffered massively in the space of confusing policy intentions as being the real thing. Some senior managers, we stop them in the performance agreements when they are counting the workshops they have attended as if a workshop is a deliverable. As a senior manager. Now you begin to see that we've become a country of intentions with very poor implementation. The second one, to have a pan-African perspective, even if you're a small business, would mean that we move from this BEE, which is talking about how to provide food for primary schools in the nearby village. But then begin to influence policy to say, in our Africa approach, how do we fit in the value chain such that the rising tide of the bigger investors also benefit the smaller providers? In that way, you'll stop having somebody who says, I'm an emerging businessman for 20 years. You are permanently emerging. Each time you are putting an application, you are emerging. But I do think that we have to think out of the box in some instances. Let me put one idea, for example. Most countries which have developed the small businesses, the entrepreneurs, they invest heavily on venture capital, risk. People come with ideas. Given our fiscal constraints, we would have to be more creative in involving your CEOs forum, your big businesses, because some reports are saying our big businesses in South Africa, which are concentrated in different sectors or monopolies, have been sitting on cash, and their liquidity levels are almost not comparable to anyone's in the world. In fact, one study said, even if you were to have a depression and economic crisis, some of the banks would never even have to borrow. That's how much cash they are sitting on, because there's little faith in investing in the system. And interestingly, some of these things are raised by Americans, by Europeans, to say the ratio of liquidity. Now, if we were to have a serious engagement to say, big businesses, you also have stake in the success of this country. How do we make sure that your social responsibility towards injecting some in your entrepreneurial programs? But all this has to start with a value chain which makes sure that you have good education system, developing appropriate human capital, you have good institutional capacity, good leadership, clear vision, and all role players playing their part. Then we'll begin to have a sense of where we are going and have a greater impact in the continent as well. I think I will stop there. The rest is for us to begin to think continentally, even if you're based in your village. Because it starts there. And each time you're sitting there, the time when you think your certificate will give you jobs, it's almost gone. Many people are spending 5 to 10 years looking for jobs. Now, they say in the meantime, between the certificate and the job I'm looking for, can you imagine the things you'll have resolved by just looking at your community and say, with the mind I have, what are the problems in the community that I could solve? Rather than what business can I start to make money, but rather what are the problems that I can solve? Then money follows. It's a change of mindset. Thank you.
Issues relating to entrepreneurship, issues relating to job creation, issues to thinking pan-African and finding ways of saving our own continent. There's a bit that we did not touch on that would actually make for quicker entrepreneurship at a smaller scale. And these would include, amongst others, tourism. Tourism is an industry that we could exploit to very, very good effect. Tourism in South Africa accounts for something like 9.5 to 10% of job creation. Elsewhere, tourism would be anywhere between 15 and 25%. And there is a sense in which right there, you could actually create a great deal. Some countries on this continent are in fact so fertile, it's about anywhere where the seed might fall, it grows even without being nurtured. But people go to bed hungry. People battle to export, things like bananas. I saw bananas growing wild in the DRC, wild, big, nice, golden bananas. Imagine if you actually took trouble to actually cultivate and nourish them, how much you would actually provide to Africa, how much you would actually export. And somehow, even with that God-given fertility of the soil, we starve for lack of creativity. So the great deal that I believe, if we sat together and actually found ways to stimulate ourselves intellectually, there's a great deal that we could actually do. We need time to discuss, and time is normal. If you allow it, I should just perhaps conclude by sketching what I believe might constitute the kind of vision that I believe might ignite some of our thinking as Africans. I think I would be pretentious if I was to say that I could actually give you a statement of vision, right here, craft it and give it to you. But there are elements that I would like to suggest that we should actually see in place. I dream of an Africa whose children are fed by native produce. There's just so much we can do to transform ourselves from the basket cases that we are into food baskets for feeding our own nation and exporting. I would like to suggest that the vision that could actually be fairly compelling would be that of a continent whose intellectuals are nurtured by indigenous foundation principles and insatiable inquiry. Why can't we think originally? I envision a beloved continent whose industry is essentially fueled by native technology and skills. We can learn from others, but we can also configure that which is uniquely ours. I also envision a Western Africa whose airwaves and media are dominated by issues of continental concerns, images, and aspirations. And very, very importantly, an Africa that redefines the term emergent from a notion of condensation and derision to a concept of economic, political, and cultural vibrancy and technical prowess. And finally, an Africa that seeks and employs the advice, skills, technology, and resources of others for its own ends and to its chosen destination, and not to serve the agenda of others. An Africa who is a matriarch of her own destiny. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end.